Welcome everyone to our first session of the virtual conference. As you all know, we had to reschedule our conference in Michigan to 2022 because of the pandemic, but we're very grateful to be able to connect with all of you electronically instead. The theme of this conference is Mission in Christ's Way, and it's focusing on the mission of our church. Now, we're not able to have all the sessions that we originally wanted to have exploring this theme, but I thought it was very important that we still have this session with Tim on multi-ethnicity. Because as I'm sure Tim will share, there is great power in the church's witness when people from every tribe, every nation, and every tongue make the common confession that Jesus is Lord. And so I think this is a very timely message for us in light of the recent protests for equal rights for ethnic minorities, especially African Americans. But it's also relevant for three other specific reasons that I just want to quickly highlight. The first reason is that many of us who grow up in the church in North America are actually unaware that the Church of South India is a multi-ethnic church, representing primarily 4 language groups in southern India: Malayalam, Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada. However, even though we are a multi-ethnic church in India, and even though we have Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada speaking members in our churches, it's no secret to anyone that in North America, we are heavily and predominantly Malayali. And none of us should be ashamed of our culture. We should honor our culture and value our culture for the good things it gives us, but we can never make our culture ultimate. And the truth is, there are congregations in North America from these other language groups that worship according to CSI tradition, but that are not a part of our network of churches called the Council of CSI Churches in North America. And the reason that they're not part of our network is because they are distrustful of a majority Malayali institution. That's just the reality. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we respectfully include those of other language groups who are attending our churches already, or who are in CSI traditioned churches outside the council? So that's one issue. Second, as many of you guys just know from living here, like as youth grow older in the United States and Canada, it's just reality that some of us are marrying people of other ethnicities. And we don't really talk about that. And we certainly don't do things proactively to make those in interracial marriages or those youth who are biracial feel welcome in our churches. And that's something that absolutely needs to change. And then finally, through my work volunteering with InterVarsity at UT in Austin, University of Texas in Austin, I know that there are many South Asian college students who come from Muslim and Hindu backgrounds who are responding to the gospel and turning to Christ. And one of the reasons they tell me that they gave Christianity a chance is because they saw through interacting with Indian Christian students that Christianity is not just a white European thing. And that just provided a little bit of openness for them to hear Christianity out. But after they convert, Indian Christian students don't always feel comfortable inviting these new converts to our churches, right? We send them to other churches. And that's tragic. And so one thing that we should be thinking of is how we can, as a church, partner with college campus groups like South Asian InterVarsity chapters in our cities and just be a place that welcomes and engages with non-Christian South Asian students and welcomes in the newly converted South Asian students. So I'm highlighting all this to say to you, as we listen to this conversation with Tim tonight, let's be asking ourselves these questions. Ask yourself, what are the practical things we can do as a youth movement and as a local church to welcome those of other ethnicities while still valuing and honoring our own culture? Tim is a friend of mine for almost 2 years now. He works with graduate students at UT through InterVarsity College Campus Ministry. He attends the Austin Chinese Church. He's married to Janie. They're expecting a baby soon. And here's a little bit outline. Here's a little bit of an outline on, 3 weeks, as Tim just notified. 3 weeks away, so it's coming soon. Here's how tonight will go. Tim will make some opening remarks. Then I have a few prepared questions to ask Tim for about 40 minutes, I think. It might be a little less. And then we'll take questions from all of you for the last 30 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to chat them to us, or at the end of the conversation, you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly to Tim. So with that, let me hand it over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Brian. And it's great to see everybody on this call. I was going to be with y'all in Detroit for y'all's summer conference. And when we found out it was going to have to be canceled, I was really disappointed. It was something I was looking forward to as maybe a highlight of the summer, other than my baby. So I've had to put all my energy towards looking forward to, her birth rather than her and the conference. But when Brian was like, I've been a part of a multi-ethnic church in the past, but the churches that I've been a part of have predominantly been mono-ethnic. And so, the topic is something that I've been really interested in for a long time, and that really grabs my attention and in some ways grabs my heart. But in terms of personal on the ground experience, I don't have a lot. So, this will be coming at y'all as a learner. And I think really what I want for today, because I'm boring, you could probably only focus and listen to me for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I kind of want this to be a conversation in some way. And I know Brian has a lot of insight. And so I'm hoping this will be helpful for y'all as you think about how the CSI can really be thinking about multi-ethnicity in your own context and the unique ways that y'all are positioned to really engage in that a little bit more deeply. But I guess to start us off, just like a short opening word, Brian asked me the question of like, maybe spend a few minutes just speaking on why I believe multi-ethnicity matters to the church specifically in North America. So I'm not, for the Canadians on the call, I'm sorry, I didn't know where Brampton was, learning new things every day. But, I'm not too familiar with the Canadian context, but I think there's just four, as I thought about it, there's four broad categories why I think multi-ethnicity matters specifically in the North American context. So the first one, obviously, as Christians is, and we'll be talking about this a little bit more, is it's biblical, right? If you look at, Revelation 7:9, right? This picture of the end times and this vision of the church. It says that the church is a gathered people from all nations, languages, and tribes. And so there's this distinct multi-ethnic dimension to the vision of what the church can and should be. And so I think at the end of the day, what that means for us is, we have this vision of what it will be in the future. Is it something that we can pray for and strive for and desire here and now? And my thought is it is, and it should be. And even if our maybe unique context makes it really hard to have a multi-ethnic church, I think it should be a burden that we have, because it's a burden and a command and a vision that's clear in Scripture. So that's the first one, and we'll unpack that a little bit more, maybe the biblical kind of timeline or story as it relates to that. But the second one is just maybe the theological aspect. And what I mean by that is, we understand God to be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And as you think about that, there's this dynamic interplay within God that is both dependent and independent. And so there's this interdependence that's at play in the reality of the Trinity that I think in some ways can really be embodied and expressed in the life of a diverse and multi-ethnic community or body. And so there's a theological kind of impulse that's inherent in who God is, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then the last two is really the practical dimension. I think we live in a very diverse kind of globalized world. what's happening in Asia. We can see the tangible effects in our lives here today pretty immediately and pretty clearly. And so I think the diversity of our globalized world, and the fact of the matter is North America is getting more diverse by the day. I think it's something like by the mid 21st century, the majority of America is going to be a minority population. So it's going to be a majority minority country in 30 years. So I think that kind of impulse, the fact that we're living in a more globalized world, we're living in a more diverse country, it really confronts us with the question of how do we deal with difference? How do we deal with differences? I mean, I think in the news, with the protests with the George Floyd, I think that question, dealing with differences, can be highlighted just in that, this injustice and how people are responding to it. So you can parse this out in all fields, in education, in your family. Like Brian said, there's going to be more interracial couples, in your schools, in your workplaces, and really in the church. So I think we have to ask the question of, how do we engage and deal with this aspect of difference that we see around us? What is the church's role in that? And I think, and it's kind of, this is lastly connected to the last piece. And the last piece, I think there's a missional element to why multi-ethnicity matters, and I think it's that question of, what does it mean as a church for us to be shaped by the gospel? Or even more broadly, what does it mean to be the church, really? And a bigger question. I'm sure Brian's shared this with y'all. One of the reasons why Brian and I are good friends is we both really admire this the bishop and theologian, he's dead now, missionary to South India, Leslie Newbigin. And he has a whole book that we've discussed that's called The Household of God. And it's really about understanding what the nature of the church is. And part of his argument is that at its core, the church is a missional community. And it's a community that's shaped by the gospel. And so I think at the end of the day, if that's what the church is, we need to ask ourselves, what are we communicating about the gospel if our church is just composed of, say in my case, primarily Chinese people, or primarily, people of one ethnicity? What does that communicate about our understanding of the gospel? And what does that communicate about what we mean as a church that strives to be shaped by the gospel? So I think there's missional implications there. I think Brian hinted at that. So those would be the four broad reasons why I would say multi-ethnicity matters today, or it's a big question, right? The biblical aspect, the theological aspect, the practical aspect, and the missional aspect. So.
Awesome. Yeah, that's kind of covers all the bases. So I think that's going to be really helpful. I guess as we get started, how would you define a multi-ethnic church, right? Like, so it seems like for these various ways you just discussed, expressing the theological truth of like the diversity and unity of God.
Yeah.
Worship in the future is going to be multi-ethnic, so we should be worshiping in a multi-ethnic fashion. You kind of touched on all those different reasons.
Yeah.
Like, what is multi-ethnic church?
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting, and I think Brian highlighted this earlier, is that, I think before the 20th century, I guess ethnic groups or ethnicities were primarily understood as nation states. So they were really understood in kind of a political, a kind of social political dynamic. And it wasn't until I think a missionary or missiologist really kind of redefined what ethnic groups mean, specifically as it relates to the Bible. And he understood it as a more of a linguistic category. And so I think, if you look at it that way, right, Brian, y'all's church, at least in Houston, or maybe the CSI more broadly, there's so many ethnic linguistic groups that comprise the community. And so in that sense, it is truly a multi-ethnic context, or there are multiple ethnicities within your church. Um, but maybe more the standard definition in terms of the numbers, the textbooks say like a multi-ethnic church is any sort of church that has 20% or more of the church composed of an ethnic minority. So if you had, a Chinese church and 79 in the church had 100 people, and 79 of them were Chinese, and the 21 others were other ethnic groups, you would say that statistically that's actually a multi-ethnic church. But I don't know if, from my perspective, I think maybe it's helpful in some sense to have that definition, but I think it's more helpful. There's one of the a professor I had to take a class under. He was like a missiologist and was a missionary in Asia for many years. And he says a more helpful way of defining a multi-ethnic church is when there's basically an attitude and a practice within the church of accepting peoples of all ethnic, class, and national origins as equal and fully participating members of the fellowship of the church. And he goes on to define this as, that kind of attitude and practice is manifested in the involvement of people in the church from different ethnic and social and national kind of communities to be members. So in some sense, I think that understanding of multi-ethnicity is more helpful because it doesn't really establish like a percentage kind of criteria, and it doesn't really establish any sort of model, a specific model or a specific format that needs to characterize the church. I think it really focuses more on belonging and belonging across differences. And I think there can be, instead of a statistic as someone sitting in a pew, you really have to get at people's hearts and really why they're there and what they really feel about their place in the church community. So
Yeah, that kind of like anticipates what was my follow-up question, which was, in recent years, there seems to be criticism or more criticism you hear of the definition of multi-ethnicity just in looking at who's in the pews and saying 20% of them are usually non-white. Like, so 80% is white, 20% is non-white. And so, voila, you have a multi-ethnic church. And you're kind of pushing back on that and saying that multi-ethnicity goes more in, should be understood, it's better understood in terms of the involvement of people in the actual like life of the church, activity of the church, participation in the church, like of people who are not the majority culture. Is that like fair, kind of a fair restatement of what you're saying?
Yeah. And I think it has to do more with a sense of equality across lines that tend to divide, whether it's your ethnicity, whether it's your socioeconomic status, whether it's your nationality, your country, your country of origin. And I think oftentimes even, it's interesting that we're having this conversation because I'm a part of a Chinese church and y'all are all within a South Asian denomination. But really this conversation around multi-ethnicity or multi-ethnic churches is primarily a conversation within churches with white pastors or predominantly white communities. And I think sometimes the critique that Brian was mentioning about these multi-ethnic churches is, there are these leaders who lead multi-ethnic churches, but maybe they're continuingly to only listen to, mono-ethnic voices, or, they confuse just having people in the pews who are maybe a little bit more diverse. They hit the statistic, but they don't really have that sense of belonging and equality, or, they may lead a multi-ethnic church, but their relationships outside of the church don't really reflect that. And so I just think it's interesting that we're having this conversation, and even you're having this conversation within your own ethnic communities, within your church body, because in the wider conversation tends to be a little different. And so I wonder what the opportunities there are, and the kind of witness there is within that.
Did you want to say, I know you had already kind of talked about the biblical basis for multi-ethnicity, but did you want to say more on that or elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, if I don't bore y'all, yeah, I mean,
Yes,
if it doesn't
please.
bore y'all,
It's not going to bore us. We love the Bible.
So the Bible can be pretty intimidating, right? It can be a pretty intimidating book because there's so many different genres, there's so many different authors, there's so many different pages, so many pages of the Bible. So it's hard to understand like what the message is, right? So one thing that was really helpful for me in just getting a better grasp of the Bible and the biblical story and the message is this idea of biblical theology. And I think what biblical theology, what makes it unique or maybe different to systematic theology, is that systematic theology tends to choose a topic, right? It's like, oh, we want to learn more angels, and we try to come up with our best of that topic. But biblical theology, the difference is what it tries to do is it tries to trace, from beginning to end, kind of a common and allow that to kind of speak into given topics. And so, a lot of folks have kind of traced the biblical narrative as it relates to ethnicity in the Bible. And I think I just want to highlight some because I think it's really interesting. What I said in Revelation 7, that's the very end of the biblical message. But you can even say that this idea of ethnicity and difference, it starts in Genesis. And, it starts in Genesis 11 with this idea of the Tower of Babel, right? And so, you have in Babel, God responding to the arrogant kind of rebellion of mankind by confounding their language and spreading them out, right? And sending them out and kind of having difference and division within these communities. But on the very next page, the very next chapter, you can kind of see God's multi-ethnic plan of redemption, specifically in the covenant promise that he gave to Abraham in Genesis 12. Because specifically in that covenant promise, he says that all nations will be blessed in your seed, right? So you see something about God trying to really take care of this problem of Babel, and through this covenant that he enforced with Abraham. And then that promise, is sharpened in many ways through the Old Testament. David is given not given, he's promised, right, this kingship that's universal, that's everlasting, that will be established over all the earth. There's different passages that highlight that all the nations will be blessed through this Davidic kingship. And then further, the prophets, they continue to kind of clarify this vision as they kind of foretell this restoration in which Israel becomes not just ethnic Jews, but people from all nations who worship God, who know Yahweh as the true and living God. You can look in Isaiah and find that. You can look in Zechariah and find that. They're in the prophets, this vision of the future. And so you get to the New Testament, and many people have argued that in the New Testament, this idea of this global redemption of all nations, it comes to fulfillment in Jesus. And this boundary that used to divide the people of God by Jewish identity, right? If you want to be the people of God, you had to be a Jew, you had to be circumcised, you had to follow these laws. These boundaries get extended to anyone who expresses repentance and faith in Christ. And you can say to a degree that Israel is regathered and reconstituted and resurrected into this new family under Jesus as the Messiah, right? Under this new covenant. That's how they describe it, kind of theologically. And so faith in Jesus becomes this defining mark of membership into the new people of God. And the way that this really gets highlighted is in Acts. If you study Acts is all about, the gospel being extended to wider kind of concentric circles. And it goes out and out and out to people who once were excluded, who once weren't in the family of God, who now are a part of that. And so, and the idea in Acts oftentimes is that these communities are really communities that really embody, by the Holy Spirit, they really embody and reflect the power of the gospel to bring these people together, and to break down these dividing walls in some ways. And then after that, right, the New Testament culminates in that vision of John's vision in Revelation of all tribes, all nations, all peoples. And so, there's kind of a through line from beginning to end of, dealing with this problem of difference and diversity, and the church being an expression of handling that problem, of breaking down those walls or those barriers. The book that I referenced earlier, the Leslie Newbigin book, The Household of God, it's all about what the church is. That's the whole book. And the last chapter, for any of you who read it, the last chapter, Brian, do you remember what the last chapter is? The last chapter is titled Unto All the Nations. And that's the idea. If the church isn't a missionary church to all nations, then in Newbigin's mind, maybe as he would argue the Bible's mind, you're not really being what the church is called to be. And so that's maybe a bigger unpacking of the biblical argument of why multi-ethnic churches are important, or something to really think about and consider.
Well, I mean, given all that, and given that my hero Leslie Newbigin says that too, I'm going to ask you kind of this aggressive question then. Is it wrong to have an ethnic church then? In recent years, like, especially with everything going on politically, there's been kind of some pushback to the multi-ethnic conversation. Granted, as you said earlier, like the multi-ethnic conversation is usually led more by like white voices trying to reform predominantly white churches. But there's been kind of like a pushback in saying there's value in having ethnic minority churches. So kind of like, I know you and I have talked a lot about this, but how would you answer that? Is it wrong to have an ethnic church then?
It's funny. I mean, if I said it was wrong, then there would be something wrong about being at the church I'm at, because it's a Chinese church. Now, granted, we have multiple languages within the church, so you can say to a degree maybe it is a multi-ethnic church based on how you define it. I think there's legitimacy to that. But no, I think a lot of it depends on the church and the church's vision and the church's mission. If the church, I think it would be wrong if the church said that we don't care about all nations, or we don't care about going forth and preaching the gospel to all nations. Now some people can say that, practically there may be cases in which you aren't really reflecting that in the way that you do church, or the way that you understand yourself as a church. And I think those critiques may be valid, and those critiques actually are probably helpful in the church kind of reforming and repenting and really growing in the ways that it really needs to. Because I guess the challenge for the mono-ethnic church, one, you have to know that the ethnic minority or the immigrant or ethnic church, you have to know its history, why it is the way it is. I think that's really important. But I think the challenge for ethnic churches is how do we deal with the critique of homogeneity. And I don't know if this is y'all's history, but people who advocate for homogeneity in the church, they tend to say, it's much more strategic to remove cultural barriers to the gospel by establishing mono-ethnic and monocultural churches, because it's just easier to connect with people. It's easier to communicate with people culturally and in maybe their heart language. And so homogeneity is actually a value towards mission and a value towards reaching more people, specifically in maybe that ethnic group or specifically within that culture. But sometimes I think it can be naive maybe to have that mentality, but to not recognize our sinful hearts and the ways in which we might have the disposition towards, kind of ethnocentric prejudice maybe, and the ways that being a, ethnic specific church may reinforce that, or it might be hard to break out of that or to repent of that. And so I think if you're an ethnic church, you really need to be wrestling with that dynamic, and thinking about what that means for the life of your communities and how you're wrestling with that. But oftentimes in ethnic churches, there's always the challenge of the first generation and second generation. How do we pass on the faith to the next generation in a way that's meaningful, in a way that's faithful to the gospel, and maybe faithful to maybe this cultural expression of it.
Yeah, that's good. Are there churches that are pursuing multi-ethnicity well in North America today? Do we have like good examples?
I mean, I'm sure there are. I mean, I'm sure there's great examples. I'm sure there are probably pretty bad examples too. I don't know. From my own experience, I don't know. So I guess I don't feel confident giving, I don't know, churches, pointing to churches out there that are doing a good job. I will say this much though. The only time I've been a part of a truly multi-ethnic church is when I was in college. I was a part of a small community church, and the main reason I think it did a good job in multi-ethnicity is because it had a multi-ethnic leadership team. Our pastor was African American. One of the elders was Mexican. One of the elders was Puerto Rican. A couple of the elders were white. And it just naturally, they just drew the communities and people that they were in relationship with and that they were a part of. So it wasn't, I don't even know if I would say it did it well, but we had a multi-ethnic community, and I think that was the main reason why. Brian, do you know of any? I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts, or anyone else for that matter. I'm curious.
I personally have not. I've attended predominantly white churches where there are minorities attending, but they might meet the definition of multi-ethnicity, sort of statistically, like you talked about at the top, in that like over 20% of them might be minorities. But in terms of like participation, leadership, kind of maybe inclusion, I would not necessarily describe them as multi-ethnic. That's just been my experience.
Yeah. It's really hard.
Yeah.
So.
Why is it hard though? I guess that's because I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I wasn't gonna say anything. Go ahead.
Okay, I thought someone had said something.
Oh.
Why is it so hard to pursue multi-ethnicity? Because I remember when you had talked about your experience in college with me a while back, and even then you had said like it was hard. So what are the obstacles to multi-ethnicity? Why is this so hard?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot. Um, so I think the first one, right, is what I said earlier, this appeal to homogeneity. I think sometimes we think, okay, it's being homogeneous, it's easier, right? Because I think in some ways it is. Um, and so that's a challenge because there's that impulse, right? It's more pragmatic in some ways. And, we're Asian, we're pragmatic people. I think maybe that's a similarity between our cultures. We get the job done. So I think there's that. But I think a big one, at least from my experience, a big one is just discomfort. Maybe the fear of discomfort. The idea that we don't know how to deal with discomfort. And specifically, there's three things I think when you think about minorities in any sort of context, to really serve them well, if you're in the majority context, you have to think about three things, and those three things are always, they have to do with comfort in a lot of ways. And the three things are, they all start with P, so hopefully this will be easy to remember: pain, power, and the past. And so when you think about leadership and minority leadership, maybe in a majority kind of context, in order to really serve them well, if you're in the majority, you have to understand people's pain. People's pain, specifically being a minority, the ways that they've experienced that pain in the church community, the ways they've experienced that pain in society, the ways that they've experienced that pain in their families even. And you have to be sensitive to that, and you also have to be sensitive to power, and the ways that power is kind of, we like to I think ideally, right, the church, we're about service, right? We're different than the world in that sense, but power can seep into the church, and there are dynamics that we need to be mindful of and sensitive to. And so if you're in the majority, understand the ways in which your power can be wielded and how it's experienced, is important if you really want to serve minorities well. And then the last one is the past. And I think this one broadly is not just people's individual pasts and histories, but maybe collective histories as it relates to a specific minority group. Whether it's that their kind of immigration history, whether that's their cultural history, whether that's maybe their history of their experience in America more broadly. I think you have to understand those things to really be able to serve minorities well, to empower them, and to give them a place to really be able to lead out of who they are. Otherwise, the temptation is just to assimilate and to be quiet. And I imagine many people have experienced that. So discomfort's a big, and all of those aspects, they're not comfortable. They're not easy. So I think discomfort is a really big obstacle into having maybe real meaningful or real multi-ethnicity in North American churches. I think Paul in First Corinthians 9 it can be really a really instructive passage as it relates to this, because it's Paul kind of outlining how he's really seeking to be all things to all people in order to reach them. Kind of the ways in which Paul's giving up his comforts, embracing discomfort for the sake of others and for the sake of the gospel. So discomfort's a huge one. This is kind of tied to it. The dominant culture dynamics. There oftentimes there's, you're welcome as long as you do it our way. I think that's a big obstacle, from people voicing differences and sharing from their experience and those kinds of things. I think another big one is, maybe this is probably true of immigrant churches more too, is cultural assumptions about church. I think sometimes I'm second generation, and I think sometimes with the second generation in the Chinese church, there's maybe different cultural assumptions of what the church is and what the church should be. I just don't think that, at least in my context, the first generation is thinking of multi-ethnicity in the way that we are because they don't have to live with it in the same way that we do. So I think there's different cultural assumptions about church that can make it challenging. And then maybe broadly just language and communication challenges. You know, some cultures are more indirect in how they communicate. Other cultures are more direct. I mean, I think those can lead to a lot of issues and problems if they're not really understood. So, does anyone have any other thoughts? I mean, those are the ones that came to my mind.
Yeah, we can open it up if anyone wants to respond. Or you can unmute yourselves at the end too. And yeah, we're nearing the end of my questions, so feel free to chat in your questions or unmute yourself at the end. And, you can talk to Tim, share your thoughts, share your feedback. You know, you had mentioned like the differences between the first generation and the second generation, and just knowing our youth members and the diversity even reflected there. Like there are all of us, I think, value our culture, and all of us want to respect our parents. There are differences even within the youth itself. Like some people were born and raised here, but still very strongly culturally identify as Malayali. You know, they speak Malayalam, all that kind of thing. There's some who really don't, you know, identify strongly as Malayali, and they don't have very strong command of the language. And then there are others who moved here from India. They were born in India, maybe for a considerable amount of time, and they moved here later on. And so, like, as we're thinking through all that, how can we honor our ethnic culture in church while also welcoming those of different ethnic backgrounds? Or, I mean, I guess that's the first question, and related to it is like, is it possible to value your ethnic culture in church and be inclusive? That might be another way of asking the question. So like so the more positive way of asking the question is, how do we honor the culture that we have, our ethnic culture, while welcoming those of different ethnic backgrounds?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I mean, I think y'all could probably answer this much better than I can because, you know, I don't know where the tensions are in the church community between those two things. So maybe the first question would be like, what, you know, when it comes to welcoming those of different ethnic backgrounds, like where is the tension between doing that and honoring our culture? I think maybe that's the first question. That might bring clarity. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in terms of how to do that. One thing that I thought about, or that came to my mind is, you know, have y'all ever heard of the idea of code switching? I'm sure most of us. It's the idea like, okay, you know, you know, y'all are South Asian American, I'm Chinese American. You know, we kind of live in these two worlds in some sense. And so when I'm in the predominantly Chinese world, you know, I know how to interact and I know how to operate in this context. But when I'm in a primarily more American or Western kind of context, I know how to interact, I know how to relate, I know how to talk and do those kinds of things. And so, and some of us do it more naturally than others. Granted, I'm not the greatest in terms of the Chinese culture. Some things get lost for me, honestly. I'm learning a lot from my wife, but I think we know how to do that to some degree, right? And so I wonder if in your church context, that idea of code switching could actually be a way of welcoming other people well. You know, when I'm in this context, I'm really trying to honor, you know, the first generation, or I'm really trying to honor my culture. But when I'm welcoming these new folks in our church who are from different backgrounds, I'm really trying to meet them where they're at or honor them where they're at, and kind of going back and forth. I think there's a degree in which you might have to do that. But I think also another thing to keep in mind is, you know, in InterVarsity, we have ethnic specific ministries, and a lot of that is because of the missional impulse. You know, it's like it is easier to reach people of one ethnicity, so we want to do that. but it's also because, you know, they didn't have space in these wider, you know, maybe communities that were more, they didn't have space to be who they were. Um, and so, you know, we really value that in InterVarsity. And I thought about, and I think, I think they're for churches that are really trying to be multi-ethnic. I think there's spaces to do that, and there's opportunities to do that, and there's maybe need to do that. And within a multi-ethnic church, giving people within a specific ethnicity their own space to really be affirmed and to be understood and to be known and to kind of live freely, even when they're in a wider kind of more multi-ethnic body. Um, I mean, this is maybe along more language lines than anything. But in the Chinese church and the church I go to, the way that's lived out is, you know, we're one church, but there's three different congregations. You know, one congregation that's Mandarin speaking, which has their own pastors. One congregation that's Cantonese speaking, has their own pastors, and one congregation that's English speaking. And so that's one way that we've maybe tried to engage with that a little bit.
Yeah, and that's really helpful, because when we think about our context, you know, predominantly Malayali in North America, but with Kannada, Tamil, and Telugu members sort of like sprinkled here and there, and with churches that are primarily like Tamil or Telugu, but they don't have much association with us. It seems like what you're saying kind of has some application for us in terms of like, instead of insisting that they maybe join our Malayalam worship service, we make space within our congregation somehow for them to have, you know, their language service as well. Is that kind of like what you're saying? That's one way to be inclusive.
Yeah, yeah. You know, my friend was a part of a church in Chicago, and you know, inner city Chicago, intentionally trying to be, you know, multi-ethnic church, primarily black and white, really trying to bridge that divide there. And, you know, he said it was hard, it was messy. And he said what they ended up having to do many times is like, you know, they would have like what they would call, I don't know if they call like ice cream socials or something like that. Something related to ice cream. And he would say like, oh, the chocolate ice cream is going to be, you know, doing their stuff here, and the vanilla ice cream is going to be doing their stuff here. And it was just a way that, you know, it's like, man, we're a church that's black and white. There's a lot of tensions, a lot of struggles. We're trying to be a church, but there's also time within the church. I mean, we need our own spaces, and they kind of created that within the life of the church. And they affirmed that. It wasn't like, oh, you're breeding division. It was more of like, no, we need that, and it's important, and it's a value, and so they pursued it. So it sounds like maybe there's an opportunity there, something similar.
Yeah, I think so. Are there other concrete action steps like you can think of that would help us move towards multi-ethnicity? As I mentioned, like in our context, there are more interracial marriages, more biracial kids. Um, do seem opportunities for partnership with South Asian universities. Like, what are the concrete steps we can take in our local churches now to move towards multi-ethnicity, even if it's like studying something?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Are you thinking of that question more specifically as it relates to, you know, South Asian ethnicities, or?
I think I think both. I think both. I think the South Asian ethnicities might frankly like be an easier reach if we're thinking of like concentric circles. Um, they might be an easier reach,
Yeah.
but I think we need to be thinking about both.
Okay. Um, I think for me, I think I really value like just understanding people's personal experiences. Um, and so, you know, if you don't know, or if you've never really asked maybe someone who is of a minority ethnically in your church, what their experience has been like, you know, places where they've really felt affirmed, places where they may have felt marginalized, places where they felt supported, encouraged. I would say just try and get to know that, I'm sure there's opportunities all the time to just kind of ask those questions and just be curious in that sense. I think that's a practical action step. I think there'll be good learning there. I think another one would be just inviting a friend to your church, maybe a South Asian friend who maybe isn't the majority of your congregation, and just getting a sense of what their experience was like just going to a service, and maybe picking their brain a little bit about, hey, like maybe you're not the majority of this church. Like, how did you experience that? Was there anything that was highlighted to you that made you feel a certain way? Or, just getting people's more practical experience. I think that's always helpful. I think maybe a big one, this is probably pretty hard. I don't know if y'all have done this before, but having conversations with the first generation community on their perspective on multi-ethnicity. Because I would imagine it's probably pretty different. And so just getting a sense of, where the issues lie, where's the misunderstandings, where's the need for growth. That's probably another one. Another idea I would have just encouraging your pastor, right? Encouraging your pastors to preach on the power of the gospel to transcend and overcome some of these cultural ethic barriers. I think when pastors preach on it more, it's on our minds and hearts more. So encouraging that might be a easy practical step. I mean, if you specifically know of ethnic divisions in the church, I would say to start praying about them, praying for them. Praying about them, talking about them. Brian said, like, learning more. Something related to learning. I think another big one maybe is, each of y'all's churches are probably in some ways very similar, but I think in some ways very unique, given the city you're in, the neighborhood, your context, your country. So in terms of this question of multi-ethnicity, y'all may have different issues. So it may be valuable to just, in your church community, like, assign a task force. Hey, let's have three people within the church just come together and over a period of time try and figure out, what are the unique challenges and opportunities within our church community in really growing in this area, and then presenting it to the church, or using it for more meaningful action steps in the future. Those are the ones that come to mind. I mean, I guess another big one is just hiring staff. From what Brian shared with me, that might be harder for y'all given y'all's situation, but maybe hiring staff that are of a ethnic minority, that would have maybe a little bit of a different voice, a different perspective, that might be helpful. Those are the ones that come to my mind. How about you, Brian, or anyone else?
I think I would just add probably leaning more into the fact that our church is part of the Anglican Communion. I think that's not something that's really discussed in the diaspora churches here in North America, that we are part of this global communion, where there are Nigerian churches and Kenyan churches and, Australian churches and, all over the world, Singaporean churches. And we don't understand that. We just think of our own like little, CSI corner, and not understand we're part of this like huge global network of churches.
Yeah.
And those other diaspora immigrant Anglican communities are also in North America. And I think that's an easy way for us to like partner with people who are liturgically very similar to us. Not just similar, they're the same as us. Yeah.
Well, that's a great thought. And it makes me think of maybe, it's something related to it, expanding your friend group. expanding your church friend group. It's like maybe all my friends are within the CSI church community, but like Brian said, oh, there's a, Hispanic Anglican community in Houston down the street from us. Let's introduce ourselves and just try and get to know them and maybe become friends. I think that could be a wonderful opportunity in leaning into that and learning and growing and building friendships. I think friendship is a big aspect too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we've kind of reached the end of my questions. I've got a question already, but for everyone else, please send in more questions if you have them, or you can unmute yourself and ask Tim. The question I have is,
it's either my talk was like perfect, so there's no questions, or it was just really boring. So people just don't. Really
it was not boring. So okay. It's just that you were very comprehensive.
All right, that's what I thought, but we're trying to be humble.
So the question is, if the future of the CSI church is to be a multi-ethnic church, how would you address the concerns of our members of losing our culture? So I think this question is kind of, it's true. Like in our context, the idea of passing down our culture is something that's like very tied into church, because church is also sort of an ethnic sanctuary, like the place where we can kind of be ourselves safely. I'm sure like this is somewhere in the Chinese church context.
Yeah.
How would you address that?
My thought, that's a legitimate fear. My thought, and this goes back to kind of my whole idea, maybe some of us have different conceptions of church. Just because I think that's a legitimate fear, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And the reason why I say that is because I think a place, an alternate institution where you can really pass down culture, and it might actually be stronger, is actually within the family. And so I wonder if I think when you have both church and family reinforcing cultural values, I mean, it's stronger for sure, right? It's thicker, it's stronger. Maybe I'll know that from personal experience. But I would say if you're in a family context where the husband and wife really both have a desire to pass on their culture, and they share a culture to their family, to their children, I think it's still possible if you have a church that doesn't value that, where that you can still do it personally for your kids and your family. And it might be harder in some ways because you don't have that reinforcement from your community, and you might be having to explain yourself all the time, or you might be having to navigate differences a lot more. And so it's definitely, I think it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's possible.
Yeah, I would just add to, I agree. Like, as you said, Tim, it's easier to pass down culture when it's like community, whether it's church community or another community plus family kind of working together to pass those cultures down to the next generation. But in the church context, the question we have to be asking, I think, is like, what is ultimate? Like, what is church for? Exactly like you were talking about with New Begin in the household of God. What is church about? And the church is about making much of Jesus, right? Like the church is about exalting the gospel above all else. If we have an opportunity to pass down our culture through that as well, cool. And maybe we can make specific ethnic spaces, like you were talking about in the Chicago church. Maybe we can allow for that somehow. But if we sacrifice on like living out the gospel in order to pass down culture, I think it's fair to say that we're not being faithful as a church to what we're called to be.
You said a much heavier word than I did, my friend.
Yes. Well, you inspired me. That's why. Any other questions?
We planned that.
Tim and Ron, we do have a question, and our question is particularly about kind of the context of our church, knowing that at least for a lot of our churches, we might be mono-ethnic, but it looks to be more multicultural because we have elders who have grown up in a particular culture, and we've got young kids who are growing up in an altogether different culture. So can you speak more to how to even start conversations of people with different cultures, particularly on looking at one point, right? For example, how you mentioned inviting new friends to our churches, for example. When we started doing that, for our scenario, we do have 2 of our services every month that are in our native language and 2 services in English. So it gets difficult at that point, right? For example, to invite a friend, because I mean, that would really mean we're inviting them to 2 of the 4 services, right? And so that kind of puts a barrier for us. So how do we go about starting kind of a shift to what you're talking about?
Man, I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I think my gut says, really seeking older generation. And I imagine that there would be that looks like, maybe some tension, maybe some compromises. But as a perspective that we don't, and so doing it in conversation with them, I think having someone who's really savvy and, a bridge builder between both kind of communities. I get the impression Brian has some of that role. I think really utilizing them and being a voice, just maybe creatively taking some risks. I think sometimes, the church can be a little stagnant because we don't always know how to take risks, and maybe we have a fear of failure. It's like, we planned something but it just doesn't go the way we desired, and I think that's okay, man. I think there's so much you can learn from that. Maybe I say that because I tend to fail things a lot, so I kind of had to learn. but yeah, I think maybe taking some risks and experimenting, if you have the blessing of maybe the church and the leaders and saying, hey, we're going to try some different things, and who knows what it's going to look like, but we're just going to explore and experiment and see what God does. I don't know if that was helpful, but Brian?
Yeah, no, I think that was helpful. One thing, answering that question, it depends. Like, I'm just thinking about different churches. The answer to that question depends so heavily on like the specific church. Some churches are bigger, some churches are smaller. Some churches have like a lot of second generation folks where they would be able to pull off some more creative things. Others are more limited in what they can do. But one thing I think it's worth all of us thinking about and praying about is like the opportunity for more English language services, because I do think, and being creative about that, it doesn't have, I don't know how exactly it looks in each church. Maybe it's a separate English service on the days where there is Malayalam service. Maybe it's just, instead of 2 Malayalam services or 3 Malayalam services a month, you like take one, you kind of ratchet down one. Those are all conversations I think we need to have with the older generation. And as you kind of mentioned, Tim, I think it also relies a lot on the preaching of the pastor. And so I think this is something that we need to raise with our pastors, and at least have that conversation with them. And maybe, like you said, maybe we'll fail, but keep on raising the conversation, because that's how change is going to happen. Any other questions?
One thing I've thought about, and just talking to Brian, churches by nature, right? Like we trust, we value our own people. And just talking to Brian about, the need for more indigenous leadership within the CSI and I think that's an opportunity. I know, raising up pastors and priests within your fold, right here, to be leading the way in this kind of new generation and leading the church in this kind of new direction. I think that's a big step. I mean, leadership is probably one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, it's very true. Any other questions, guys?
Hey, Tim. Hey, I'm Alan. Nice to meet you from Detroit. Just a quick question. Do you mind sharing like your contact info, like an email or something
Absolutely.
as a reference?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put it in the chat box. Okay. You know, if other people are formulating questions, you know, I'd love to just hear, you know, from y'all's perspective, just where you feel like some of the tensions or the issues lie in really seeing the church kind of pursue a more of or maybe things that you've just thought about yourself.
Hi there. This is Sanu, and we're from Toronto, up in Canada. But I do think that born in India, but came here when we were quite 3 years old. And so we've grown up completely, like English was my first language to learn. And I think in growing up in the CSI church, something that as we're getting older, we're kind of noticing is there is and it's a legitimate fear that our parents have, but there's a fear in that older generation that if we continue to, you know, we go to school here, we learn English, we learn French. In Canada, we're doing all of these things, that we're going to lose the cultural pieces that our parents so dearly hold on to, and a lot of people in our own generation do hold on to because it's their way of connecting with the culture. So I think that there's that fear there, like, you know, if we cut down our Malayalam services and we end up doing all English, then where is Malayalam going to go? How are the kids ever going to learn their mother tongue, so to speak? And, you know, we just had a baby. Congrats to you, Tim, and your wife. We just had a baby. And that's something that's already come up with parents, is like, how are they going to learn? How is she going to learn Malayalam, right? You know, Ron speaks it here and there. He understands it and speaks it more fluently, but at home, like between the two of us, we're speaking English, right? And I grew up mainly speaking English as well. So there's that fear that like we're going to lose, you know, things we might have celebrated back in India, things like the language itself, just cultural aspects that are not necessarily something that we imbibe here in Canada or in North American context. So there's definitely that piece. Like, what happens if we let go of that? What's going to happen to our kids?
I'm curious, you know, just to just kind of riff on what Sanu's shared, you know, in your communities, are there, outside of the church, are there places where, you know, culture can be reinforced and passed down, like community centers? Within the Chinese community, there's community centers that kind of function in the same way as churches do, but just not having maybe the religious kind of overhead to it. I'm just curious.
Tim, it's Ron here. And the rest of the folks online can speak as well, but I think we have Malayali Samajams and such. There's a different sort of it's not a religious, it's more of like a very much just a cultural group, I guess, per city in Toronto, and I'm pretty sure in the States as well. So there is a place for just the culture to exist for sure. But I think it's just that aspect of, I mean, to add on to Sanu's point, there's also the parents and the older generation are trying to hold on to that nostalgia of, I connect to worship in my language.
Yeah.
Likewise for us, when I say my prayer, I'm saying it in English.
Yeah.
Even if I'm saying the liturgy in our native tongue, I'm processing it in English, and I'm making sense of it for myself in English. So I think that's where just to add on to what Sanu mentioned as well. But yeah, to answer your question, there are avenues and there are ways to get involved in the culture outside of church as well, for sure, as long as the population is there.
Yeah.
I think just to respond a little bit more on that question, I don't even want to say it's like, it's not wrong for our elders to like want their specific traditions and their specific values and culture to be passed down. And I don't even think it's wrong for the church to be an avenue, like one vehicle in which like that transmission happens, because there's no such thing as like an acultural church, right? Like every church embodies some kind of culture. So we don't have to be embarrassed for being like predominantly Malayali or whatever. But I think where we run into trouble is where we value our culture so much that we won't take any, like a single step towards welcoming the other. You know, we don't even try to think creatively of ways that we might be able to be inclusive of people from other ethnic backgrounds. From my experience, it seems like many of us don't even raise the question in our churches because we know it's going to be shot down. And I think the first step for us, and I think that's my feeling on this has been reinforced from this conversation with Tim. The first step for us is raising the question. What can we do? You know, what can we do? And understanding this is going to be like a compromise. We have to honor our culture and we need to respect the wishes of those who want to be a little bit more culturally conservative. That's fair. But at the same time, like the flip is also true. They also need to compromise with us when we feel called for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of witness, for the sake of expressing the theological truths that Tim talked about. We believe it is important to be multi-ethnic. So yes, to compromise, yes, it's fine for church to be an avenue in which culture is conveyed, but there needs to be more creative thinking on how to be open. We can't accept no action as an avenue.
You know, one thing I wonder too, and you know, I think this is the experience of many Chinese churches, and then so I wonder if it might play out in y'all's context as well. But for many people who grow up in Chinese churches, you know, you kind of just adopt cultural norms and cultural values, but you don't really know why. And it's not fully always explicit, and it's not something you can really articulate and kind of affirm. And so I think in some ways it's like it can be a little disempowering, or it can feel that way. You know, it's kind of like, do fish know that they're drinking water? It's like we don't fully know that, you know. And I think because of that, maybe it can be confusing for people who are of different backgrounds when they come into the church and they experience something so maybe a little different, but they don't know how to understand it. And I wonder, right, if, you know, given that there's these different within your churches, there's different, you know, ethnic groups of the Tamil and the Telugu, and if there's distinctions that can be highlighted and affirmed, and maybe if that can be something that is talked about more in the life of the church, you know, and it's a way that maybe we can embody more fully why we're an ethnic church. You know, we value being, you know, Chinese, or Taiwanese, or Cantonese, and this is kind of what is distinct about it, and this is the ways that God's used it and, you know, redeemed these parts of our ethnicity and culture for his purposes. And so I wonder if there's spaces to affirm that more, and maybe to even just talk about it more in the churches.
Yeah, I received a comment that kind of reminds me on this. Like, one of the challenges is that the language groups in India are actually expressed in different dioceses. So you'll have like several dioceses for the Malayalam speaking churches. You'll have several dioceses for, you know, the Tamil speaking churches. And so in the life of the church, you don't necessarily have as much contact until you get to like more of the leadership level with your fellow CSI people of other language groups.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, we do have more contact with people of those different language groups, like when we go to school or work. You know, when I went to UT, I met multiple Tamil Christians, you know, who were part of the same South Asian university as me. And some of them were actually CSI, but they didn't grow up attending CSI churches because those churches in their cities were mostly Malayali. So instead they they attended like the Episcopalian church or the Methodist church or something else. And to me, that it seems like there's some kind of opportunity there. And I don't really know how we take advantage of it, but I think that's another thing that another issue we need to be raising in our churches, is that, yes, we understand back in India, the dioceses didn't really like mingle ethnicities in the way that they do in North America, but we're in North America now. And these people are CSI too, or come from CSI backgrounds. Why can't we be in partnership or in life together with them?
Yeah.
All right, well, any other questions? I'll throw it out one last time if anyone has any other questions. Okay, well, Tim, thank you so much for meeting with us. I think this was a really productive discussion. I took some notes. And so I think, especially that idea of having like a task force that maybe studies this a little bit longer, I think that's something that we can definitely like act on. So thank you for taking your time to join with us. And everyone else, the conference will continue tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Central Time. Take care, guys.
Thank y'all. Nice to meet y'all.